Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I was on my way to the cabin I had rented for the weekend, trying to get away from everything. Work had been a mess, life wasn't much better, so a few days in the woods seemed like the perfect break. I'd been driving for hours, feeling the tension ease as the city disappeared behind me. The roads became narrower, trees thicker, and eventually, I was on a dirt path winding through the forest. My GPS was spotty at best, but I had written down the directions, and the rental company had given me a map. I figured I'd be fine. At some point, I must have missed a turn. I'm still not sure when or where, but I remember driving past a fork in the road, the trees closing in a bit more. I thought maybe I was still on the right path because it all looked the same: woods, dirt road, the occasional sign. But after a while, something felt off. I should have reached the cabin by then. I slowed down, looking for landmarks or something familiar, but everything around me seemed strange and unfamiliar. Eventually, I saw a cabin up ahead, tucked back in the trees. I figured maybe I was closer than I thought, so I pulled up, relieved to see the place. The cabin looked just like the pictures I'd seen online, small, wooden, with a porch. I parked the car and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. It wasn't until I was standing in front of the door that I noticed something was wrong. There were people inside. I could hear voices, laughter, and the clatter of dishes. This wasn't my cabin. The place I'd rented was supposed to be empty, just me for the weekend. I was confused. I walked back to my car, thinking I'd better check the directions again, figure out where I went wrong. As I was pulling out the map, the front door creaked open and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with long, graying hair tied back in a loose braid. She wore a simple dress, kind of old-fashioned, like something you'd see in an old movie. She smiled at me, but it didn't feel right. Something about her expression seemed off. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sweet but strange, like she was forcing it to sound friendly. I stammered for a second, feeling awkward. I think I made a wrong turn. I was looking for a cabin I rented. Her smile didn't waver. "You're not lost. Come on in, have some dinner. It's almost ready." I was taken aback by how casually she invited me in, like we were old friends or something. My gut told me to decline, but she was standing there, staring at me expectantly. Before I could think of an excuse, a man appeared behind her in the doorway. He was taller than her, broad-shouldered, and wearing a worn-out flannel shirt. His face was expressionless, eyes fixed on me. "You should stay," he said, his voice deep and steady. "It's getting dark." I glanced at the sky, realizing the sun had dipped lower than I thought. Still, I didn't like the idea of staying with people I didn't know, especially since something about the whole situation felt wrong. But they were both standing there, waiting for me to respond, and it felt strange to refuse. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Just for a few minutes," I said. "Then I'll get back on the road." The woman's smile lightened. "Of course. Come in." I followed them inside, instantly feeling a chill as I crossed the threshold. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, with a few old lamps casting a dull yellow light. The place smelled like food, something savory and rich, though I couldn't quite place what it was. There was a small dining table set up with plates, cutlery, and glasses, like they'd been expecting someone. Two other people were already seated at the table, a teenage girl, maybe 16, and a younger boy, around 10. They both looked up at me when I entered, but neither of them said a word. The girl had the same strange smile as the woman, and the boy stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Sit," the man said, pointing to an empty chair. I hesitated for a second before sitting down. The woman disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear her moving around, the sound of pots and pans clanging together. The man sat across from me, still staring without blinking. "What brings you out here?" he asked. "Just needed a break," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Rented a cabin for the weekend, but I must have taken the wrong road." "You're here now," he said, his tone flat. I nodded, not knowing what else to say. The room was quiet except for the occasional clatter from the kitchen. I could feel the girl's eyes on me, but I didn't dare look at her. Something about her made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, the woman returned with a large pot, setting it down in the middle of the table. She ladled something thick and steaming into the bowls in front of us. It smelled strong, almost overpowering, and I felt my stomach turn. I wasn't hungry, but I knew it would be rude not to eat. "Go on," the woman urged. "Eat up." I picked up the spoon and dipped it into the bowl, hesitating before bringing it to my mouth. The taste was off. It was thick and greasy, and I couldn't tell what kind of meat it was. I forced myself to swallow a few bites, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my gut. The man kept watching me, never touching his own food. The kids ate in silence, their eyes flicking between me and the adults. The woman sat at the head of the table, smiling that same unsettling smile. "So, you're traveling alone?" she asked, her tone casual but with an edge to it. "Yeah," I said, glancing toward the window. The sun was nearly gone, and the sky outside had turned a deep shade of purple. "I should probably get going soon." "Nonsense," the man said. "It's too late to be driving now. You'll stay here tonight." My heart skipped a beat. I really can't. I need to find the cabin I rented. "You're staying," the woman said, her voice a little sharper this time. "It's not safe to be out there after dark." I could feel the tension in the room shift. The air seemed to get heavier, and the man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "You don't want to go up there," he said. "Trust me." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I didn't know how to get out without causing a scene. I stood up, trying to keep my voice steady. "I appreciate the offer, but I really need to get going. Thank you for the meal." The man stood up too, moving faster than I expected. He blocked my path to the door, his expression darkening. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low. Panic surged through me. I backed up, bumping into the table. The woman stood as well, her smile gone now, replaced with a cold, hard stare. The kids remained seated, watching the scene unfold without a word. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "I just need to leave." The man didn't move. He stood there, towering over me, his fists clenched at his sides. I glanced around the room, looking for another way out, but the only door was the one he was blocking. "You're not leaving," the woman repeated, her voice eerily calm. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest chair and shoved it toward the man, trying to create enough space to run. He stumbled back, startled, and I bolted for the door. I yanked it open and sprinted outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back. I could hear them shouting behind me, their voices echoing in the dark, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hand shook. Finally, I got the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw the cabin getting smaller and smaller, the figures of the family standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. My heart was still pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I pulled over, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with what had just happened. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to get out of there. It was my second week working at the fire lookout, and things had been pretty quiet. The cabin was small but cozy, sitting on a hill with a clear view of the surrounding forest. I spent most of my time scanning the trees for smoke, listening to the radio for any signs of trouble, and writing in my journal to pass the time. It was peaceful in its own way, and the isolation didn't bother me much. That evening, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the trees. The sky was a deep orange, and I could see the tops of the pine trees swaying gently in the breeze. I was about to make myself something to eat when the radio crackled to life. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." The voice was shaky, panicked. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button to respond. "This is the fire lookout." "Who's calling?" There was a pause, followed by more static. Then the voice came back, sounding even more desperate. "I'm lost. My camp. I can't find my camp. Please, I don't know where I am." I looked out over the forest, squinting into the fading light. I didn't see anything unusual, no smoke, no movement. But the voice on the radio sounded close, like whoever it was couldn't be more than a mile or two away. "Can you tell me where you are?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Do you see any landmarks?" There was a long pause, and I could hear heavy breathing on the other end. "I'm near a creek," the voice said finally. "I can hear the water, but I don't know where I am. I don't know how to get back." The nearest creek was about a mile east of the cabin. I knew the area pretty well from the maps I'd studied, and it shouldn't have been hard to find a way back from there. But something about the way the person spoke, the way their voice shook, made me uneasy. "Stay where you are," I said. "I'll come to you. Just keep the radio on so I can find you." I grabbed my flashlight, a jacket, and my boots. The sun was almost gone by now, and the woods would be dark soon. I kept the radio clipped to my belt as I headed out, making my way down the hill toward the creek. The air was cool, and the sound of the forest at night was louder than usual, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. As I walked, I tried to reach the person again. "Can you still hear me?" "I'm on my way." More static, and then the voice again, quieter this time. "Please hurry. I don't feel safe out here." I quickened my pace, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees closed in around me as I got closer to the creek, and the sound of the water grew louder. But something was bothering me. The voice on the radio, it hadn't sounded right. It was too calm now, like whoever it was had given up or was waiting for something. When I reached the creek, I called out, "I'm here. Can you hear me?" Silence. No voice, no response on the radio. I stood there for a moment, shining my flashlight around, looking for any sign of a person. But there was nothing, no campfire, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there recently. I pressed the button on the radio again. "Are you there?" "I'm at the creek." Nothing but static. I stood there for a while longer, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I knew there should have been some sign of a person, but the forest was empty. I tried calling out a few more times, but the only sound was the water rushing over the rocks. After a few minutes, I decided to head back to the cabin. Maybe the person had moved on, or maybe it had been a prank. Either way, I wasn't going to spend the night wandering around in the dark. I turned and started walking back, but the feeling of being watched crept up on me, like someone's eyes were on me the whole time. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the shadows and the sound of my boots on the dirt path. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the radio, trying to make contact again. "This is the lookout. Are you still out there?" There was no answer. I waited a few minutes, then tried again, but it was just static. I told myself that maybe the person had found their way back to their camp, or maybe their radio had died. But the uneasy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I spent the next hour scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. The woods were still, too still. It was like the usual sounds of the forest had faded, leaving an unsettling silence behind. Eventually, I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves, that the voice on the radio had probably found their way and was safe by now. But when I stood up to stretch and glanced out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, at the edge of the trees, there was a faint light, a small, flickering glow like a fire. It wasn't far from where the creek was, and it hadn't been there before. I grabbed the binoculars from the shelf and focused in on the light. It was a campfire, small but burning steadily. But there was no one around it. No tent, no person, just the fire burning alone in the dark. I turned away from the window, my hands shaking. Someone had been there. Someone had built that fire, but they were gone now. Or worse, they were still out there, watching. I double-checked the door, making sure it was locked. The windows were shut, the blinds pulled down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to keep busy, checking the radio again, writing in my journal, but every few minutes, I found myself looking out the window, expecting to see someone standing in the trees. Around midnight, I heard the scratching. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the cabin's outer walls. I froze, listening, hoping it was just the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, coming from underneath the cabin. Scratching, like something or someone was under the floorboards. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The night air was cold, and the forest was pitch black, except for the dim glow of the campfire in the distance. I listened carefully, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. There it was again, the scratching, coming from under the cabin. I took a deep breath and walked around to the back of the cabin, shining my flashlight on the foundation. There was a small trapdoor I hadn't noticed before, barely big enough for a person to fit through. The scratches were louder now, more frantic, like something was trapped down there. I hesitated, my heart racing, but I knew I had to see what was causing the noise. I knelt down and slowly lifted the trapdoor, shining my flashlight into the darkness below. It wasn't an animal. There was a small space under the cabin, just big enough for someone to crawl into. And there, in the dirt, were signs that someone had been living there recently: empty food cans, a dirty blanket, and a pile of old clothes. The air down there smelled foul, like rot and mildew. But whoever had been down there was gone. I backed away, slamming the trapdoor shut and stumbling back onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. Someone had been living under the cabin, watching me, listening to me. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in a chair by the window, clutching the flashlight in one hand and the radio in the other. The fire burned out sometime before dawn, and by morning, the woods were quiet again. But I knew I wasn't alone out there. I rented a cabin up north for a long weekend. It was one of those places you book online, nice pictures, look secluded. The ad said it was perfect for anyone wanting to get away from it all. I needed that. Life had been stressful, work too much, everything too much. A quiet place in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed. When I arrived, it was just as advertised. The cabin was tucked back from the road, surrounded by trees. There wasn't another house in sight. The closest neighbor was probably miles away. I unloaded my stuff, set up inside, and spent the first night just enjoying the quiet. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind in the trees. I spent the next day hiking around, exploring the woods. There was a small lake nearby where I spent a couple of hours sitting by the water, not doing much of anything. I was feeling good, relaxed. But that afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't seen when I first arrived: a shed, not far from the cabin, tucked behind some trees. It was locked. The lock was heavy, rusted. I thought it was strange that the rental description hadn't mentioned it. It was the only thing on the property besides the cabin itself, and it looked old, like it had been there a long time. I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about that shed that bothered me. I told myself it was probably just for storage tools, maybe gardening supplies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the second day, my curiosity got the best of me. I went out to the shed again and inspected the lock. It didn't look very secure, just old and rusted, like it hadn't been touched in years. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to break it open. I figured I'd come this far. It wasn't like anyone would notice. I found a crowbar in the cabin and went back out to the shed. It didn't take much effort. The lock broke with a snap, and the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark. The light from the afternoon barely reached in, so I took out my phone and used the flashlight to look around. It smelled damp, like mold. Dust hung in the air, and I could see old wooden shelves lining the walls, stacked with random items, tools, cans of paint, fuel crates. But then, in the corner, something caught my eye. There was a small table with something on it, something that looked out of place. I walked closer, the beam of my phone's light shaking in my hand. On the table were a few personal belongings, an old watch, a set of keys, a wallet. Next to them was a stack of Polaroid photos, faded and yellowed with age. I picked up the wallet first, opening it slowly. Inside, there was a driver's license. The name wasn't familiar, but the date of birth stood out. The license had expired over a decade ago. I looked at the keys next, house keys, maybe with a little keychain shaped like a dog. They didn't mean anything to me, but the photos. I started flipping through them. They were all people, different people, some smiling, some looking away from the camera. The first few photos didn't seem strange. They looked like vacation shots, like people who had rented the cabin before. But as I kept going through them, the pictures became off. The people in the photos weren't smiling anymore. Some looked scared, like they didn't want their picture taken. The backgrounds were all the same, the cabin, the woods, the lake. In one of the last photos, I recognized the cabin's porch, the same place I had been sitting just that morning. The person in the picture was standing in the exact spot where I had been, staring straight at the camera, eyes wide with fear. I dropped the photos and stepped back, my heart pounding. What the hell was this? Why were these things locked in a shed on this property? Who were these people? I backed out of the shed, leaving the door open behind me. My mind was racing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? I found some old photos in a shed? It didn't make sense. Maybe they were just left there by the previous owner, I told myself. Maybe it wasn't as weird as it seemed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, the fear in the faces of the people. I kept thinking about the last picture, the one on the porch. It felt like someone had been watching them, just like someone might be watching me. I got up several times during the night, pacing around the cabin, checking the windows. Everything was dark outside. The trees cast long shadows across the yard, and the only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. I kept telling myself that it was fine, that I was overreacting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone had been here and might still be here. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care that I still had a day left on the rental. I packed my things quickly, avoiding the shed as I loaded the car. I wanted to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. Just as I was about to get in the car, I noticed something on the porch. I froze. It was a Polaroid photo, sitting on the wooden steps, face down. My hands were shaking as I bent down to pick it up. I already knew what it would be. When I turned it over, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me, taken from behind, while I was standing at the edge of the lake. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone. But someone had been watching me. I threw the photo down, jumped in the car, and sped out of there. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away from the cabin, back on the highway, heading home. I couldn't stop thinking about it, who had taken that photo, and why had they left it for me to find. When I got home, I called the rental company, told them everything. They didn't seem to care. They said they'd look into it. I never heard back from them. I didn't push it. I didn't want to know more. I tried to forget about it, to move on, but I couldn't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that last photo. I wonder who those people were and what happened to them after their pictures were taken. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I get the feeling that someone is still watching me. I rented a small cabin by the beach for the weekend. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to get away from the city, to clear my head. The cabin was simple, one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area that faced the ocean. Big windows along the front of the house looked out onto the sand, and beyond that, the water stretched out endlessly. I picked this place because it was far from the main strip of beach rentals, tucked away on a quiet stretch of coast. The first day was nice. I walked along the shore, picked up some seashells, and listened to the waves crash against the sand. I didn't see anyone else the whole time, just me and the ocean. That's what I wanted, some time to myself, to think. The weather was calm then, cloudy but warm, and I could hear the wind in the distance, the sound of a storm building far off. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it howling against the windows, the wooden cabin creaking as the gusts pushed against it. The rain started shortly after, soft at first, and harder as the storm came in. The thunder sounded like it was getting closer, flashes of lightning lighting up the dark sky in quick bursts. I stayed inside, made myself some dinner, and tried to ignore the storm. It wasn't uncommon out here, being so close to the water. I told myself it was just nature doing its thing. By the time I finished eating, the wind was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I had turned on some music to distract myself, but then the power went out. Everything went dark. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning outside, bright enough to light up the entire room for just a second before disappearing again. I fumbled around in the dark for my phone, using it as a flashlight. I found some candles in the kitchen drawer and lit them, placing them around the room. The flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, more closed in. I sat down on the couch, trying to relax, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind was almost deafening now, the sound of rain pelting against the windows constant. I wasn't scared, not yet. I had been through plenty of storms like this before, and I knew it would pass eventually. I just had to wait it out. It must have been sometime after midnight when I saw him. The storm was still going strong, and I had gotten up to check the windows again, making sure they were all shut tight. As I walked past the big window in the living room, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me, the rain and wind distorting my view, but then I realized there was someone standing on the beach, just beyond the edge of the water. It was a man. He was standing completely still, facing the cabin, looking right at me. I couldn't see his face clearly, it was too dark, and the rain was pouring down, but I could tell he was watching me. My heart started to race, and I took a step back from the window, instinctively. I couldn't understand why anyone would be out there in this storm, especially at this hour. There were no other cabins nearby, no reason for someone to be on this stretch of beach. I waited for him to move, to walk away, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring. I thought about calling the police, but my phone had no signal. I was too far up from the town, and the storm probably knocked out whatever cell towers were around. I felt trapped, isolated, with no way to contact anyone. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a lost hiker or someone caught in the storm. Maybe he needed help. But as the minutes passed and he still didn't move, I started to feel uneasy, like something was very wrong. I closed the curtains, blocking out the sight of him. It didn't help. I could still feel him standing up there, could still picture him just beyond the window, watching. I told myself not to panic. Maybe he'd leave. Maybe he'd move on when he realized no one was going to let him in. But an hour passed, and I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about him, wondering if he was still there, if he had gotten closer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the curtain back just a little, peeking through the window. He was still there, closer now, standing just at the edge of the sand, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. The rain was falling harder than ever, the wind whipping through the air, but he didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his face turned toward the window. I could see more of him now. He was tall, wearing some kind of dark jacket, his hair matted down from the rain. He looked soaked through, but he didn't seem to care. He just kept watching me. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window, my heart pounding. This wasn't normal. No one would stand up there like that, not for this long. I thought about locking the door, but I had already checked it earlier. Everything was locked. I was safe inside, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, waiting for me. I walked around the cabin, checking every window, making sure everything was secure. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The storm made everything worse, drowning out any sounds except for the wind and rain. I wouldn't hear him if he tried to get in. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, and for a second, I thought I saw a shadow move outside. I froze, listening, trying to hear anything over the storm, but there was nothing. Just the relentless pounding of the rain. I went back to the window, slowly pulling the curtain aside again. My breath caught in my throat. He was even closer now, standing halfway between the cabin and the water, his feet sinking into the wet sand. I could see his face now, though it was still shadowed by the darkness. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching. I couldn't stay in the cabin. I had to get out of there, but I didn't know how. My car was parked out back, but I have to go outside to get to it. And he was right there, just a few feet away. I sat down, trying to think, trying to calm myself. The storm wasn't letting up, and there was no way I could leave until morning. But I couldn't stay here, not with him out there, not knowing what he wanted. I decided to wait it out. If he hadn't tried to get in by now, maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd leave once the storm passed. I kept telling myself that over and over, even though I didn't believe it. I sat in the dark for hours, listening to the storm, listening for any sound of him outside. Every time the lightning flashed, I checked the window, hoping he'd be gone, but he never was. He was always there, closer each time, inching his way toward the cabin, like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. By the time the storm started to die down, it was almost morning. The rain had slowed, and the wind wasn't as fierce. I gathered my things quickly, deciding I'd make a run for the car as soon as it was light enough to see. I didn't care if the roads were flooded. I'd rather take my chances driving than stay another second in that cabin. As the sky started to lighten, I checked the window one last time. He was gone. The beach was empty, the water calm. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and ran to the car. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there, but he wasn't. I drove straight home without stopping. It wasn't until I was miles away that I realized I hadn't even seen any footprints in the sand when I left. I rented a cabin for the weekend, a little place out in the woods. It wasn't fancy, just a small one-bedroom with a kitchen and a deck that faced the trees. The whole point of the trip was to get away from everything, just some quiet time to clear my head. I had a book, some food, and planned to just relax, no distractions. The nearest town was a good 40 minutes away, so it was completely isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was uneventful. I got there in the late afternoon, unpacked, and took a short walk around the property. The woods were dense, the kind of trees that block out a lot of sunlight even in the middle of the day. The cabin was set on a small clearing, with just enough space for a fire pit and a few chairs. It felt private, like I was cut off from the rest of the world. It was about an hour after I got settled when I first saw him. I was sitting on the porch, just taking in the quiet when a man came walking up the driveway. He was wearing a faded brown jacket, one that looked a bit too warm for the weather, and had a hat pulled low over his face. He waved as he got closer, a slow, deliberate motion that made me uneasy right away. "Hey there," he called out, still at a distance. "You must be the one renting the place." I nodded, standing up. I didn't know anyone else was supposed to be around, but I figured maybe he was the caretaker or something. "I'm John," he said, walking up to the steps of the porch. "I take care of the property when the owners are away. Just wanted to check in, make sure everything's in working order for you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something about him that felt off. I didn't want to be rude. "Everything's fine," I said, hoping that would be the end of it. Well, I should show you around anyway, he said, stepping onto the porch without waiting for an invitation. Make sure you know where everything is, in case you need anything. Before I could protest, he was already heading toward the door, like it was his place, not mine. I followed him inside, trying to shake the weird feeling that was creeping over me. He walked through the cabin like he knew it well, pointing out the obvious, where the bathroom was, how to work the stove, things I didn't need help with. His tone was friendly, but there was something underneath it, something a little too eager. He lingered in the living room, running his hand along the back of the couch, like he was inspecting it. Nice place, huh? He said, glancing at me. Yeah, it's great, I replied, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked over to the window, looking out at the woods. You gotta be careful out here, he said, his voice low. Gets real dark at night. No one around for miles. If something happens, you're on your own. I didn't like the way he said it, like it was some kind of warning. I stood there, trying to figure out what to say, but nothing felt right. There was something strange about the way he was acting, like he was testing me, seeing how I'd react. I'll be fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned back to me, still smiling, but his eyes were hard now, watching me closely. Sure you will, he said, then added, you're a guest here. Just remember that. He stayed for another minute, looking around the cabin like he owned the place, then finally headed for the door. If you need anything, I'll be around, he said, pausing on the porch. But don't go wandering too far into the woods. It's easy to get lost out there. With that, he walked off, disappearing down the driveway, leaving me standing in the doorway, feeling uneasy. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just a little odd, the kind of guy who spent too much time alone in the woods. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my book, trying to forget about him. But I couldn't. The way he had walked through the cabin, like he was in control, bothered me more than I wanted to admit. As the sun started to set, the feeling got worse. The cabin felt different, less like a getaway and more like a place I was trapped in. The trees outside the window were thick and dark, and the shadows inside the cabin seemed to stretch farther than they should. I decided to call it a night early, hoping that sleeping would make me feel better in the morning. I locked the front door, checked all the windows, and double-checked the back door, making sure everything was secure. The whole time, I kept thinking about John's warning, about how no one would be around if something happened. I lay in bed for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet at first, just the wind rustling the leaves, but as the night went on, I started to hear noises. Twigs snapping, the crunch of leaves underfoot, like someone or something was moving around outside. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but every time I started to relax, I'd hear it again, closer this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the cabin. The windows in the bedroom didn't have curtains, and I kept glancing at them, half expecting to see John standing outside, watching me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard something louder. A thud, like someone knocking on the front door. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. For a second, I thought maybe I imagined it, but then I heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, like someone was testing the door. I stayed still, listening, barely breathing. The knocks came again, louder this time. I didn't know what to do. My phone didn't have service this far out, and there was no landline in the cabin. I was completely cut off. I thought about opening the door, but something in my gut told me not to. It was too late for visitors. Whoever was out there wasn't here for a friendly chat. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, like someone pacing back and forth. I stood up, creeping toward the bedroom door, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The footsteps moved to the side of the cabin, closer to the bedroom window. I froze, my back pressed against the wall, listening. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then, I heard it breathing. Someone was standing just outside the window, breathing heavily, like they were waiting for me to move. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to know who or what was out there. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, without warning, it stopped. The footsteps moved away from the cabin, back toward the front porch. I heard the faint sound of something being placed on the ground, then the footsteps faded into the distance. I waited for what felt like forever before I moved. My hands were shaking as I crept toward the front door, trying to be as quiet as possible. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Slowly, I unlocked the door and cracked it open, just enough to peek outside. There, on the porch, was a small, folded piece of paper. I hesitated before picking it up, my stomach turning with dread. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, like it had been left out in the sun for too long. I unfolded it, my hands trembling, and read the single line written in shaky handwriting. I told you not to wander too far. I slammed the door shut, locked it again, and backed away, my heart racing. Whoever had left that note had been watching me, maybe for longer than I realized. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of the living room, facing the front door, waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, I grabbed my things and left, not bothering to clean up or check out. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see John following me. But the road was empty, and the cabin disappeared from view. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, trying to forget the sound of those footsteps outside my window. I went hiking alone last weekend. I'd rented a small cabin about 2 hours outside of the city. It was one of those off-the-grid types of places, no Wi-Fi, no phone service, just the quiet of the forest. That's what I wanted. I needed some time to myself, away from everything. The cabin was small but comfortable. It had one room with a bed, a little kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns and candles, which suited me fine. I thought it would be peaceful. The hike I planned was a 5-mile loop through the woods and up a ridge. Nothing too intense, just something to get my legs moving and my head clear. I left around mid-morning with a backpack of water, snacks, and a map the cabin's owner had left behind. The weather was perfect, cold but sunny, and the woods were thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, aside from the occasional bird with a crunch of leaves under my boots. I was in my own world, enjoying the silence. It wasn't until I was about an hour into the hike that I first noticed something odd. At first, it was just a feeling like someone was watching me. I brushed it off as paranoia. I was alone in the woods, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when it's too quiet. But after a few more minutes, I started to hear things. Twigs snapping, the sound of something moving through the underbrush behind me. I'd stop and listen, but every time I did, the sound would stop too. I told myself it was probably just animals. A deer or maybe a raccoon. But then I noticed something that made my heart sink a little. The trail I was on was narrow, and the ground was soft from recent rain, so my boots left clear prints in the mud. But when I glanced behind me, there were no other footprints. Not even an animal's. The snapping of twigs continued, though, and it was always behind me, just out of sight. I tried to shake it off. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. I picked up the pace, hoping the faster I walked, the sooner I'd finish the loop and get back to the cabin. But no matter how fast I went, the sounds followed. It was almost like someone or something was keeping pace with me but staying just far enough away that I couldn't see them. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached the top of the ridge. The view was amazing. The forest stretched out for miles, nothing but trees and the blue sky. For a moment, I forgot about the noises, forgot about the weird feeling in my gut. I sat down on a rock to catch my breath and took a sip of water, trying to relax. That's when I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just a twig snapping. It was a rustling sound, like someone moving through the bushes. I stood up, my heart racing, and looked around. There was no one there. just the trees standing still. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, that same unsettling feeling of being watched. I decided I wasn't going to wait around to find out who was following me. I grabbed my backpack and started back down the trail, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a full run. The whole way down, the sounds kept pace with me, always behind me, never in front. When I finally got back to the cabin, I was drenched in sweat. I hadn't stopped moving for the last 2 hours. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. I felt safer inside, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something had been following me. I tried to calm myself down, told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I went into the kitchen to get some water, but as soon as I stepped inside, I froze. Something wasn't right. The cabin looked the same, but there were small things that were off. The blanket I had folded on the bed was now draped across the chair. The lantern I had left by the door was now on the windowsill. Little things, but enough to make me panic. I hadn't left the door unlocked when I left for the hike. I was sure of it. But someone had been inside. I could feel it. I grabbed the lantern and my phone, even though there was no service, and sat in the middle of the room, facing the door. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had moved the blanket and the lantern and just didn't remember. But that didn't explain the feeling of being followed. The light outside was starting to fade, and the cabin was getting darker. I lit the lantern, hoping the warm light would make me feel safer. But it didn't. If anything, the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to grow deeper. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I was just tired from the hike and that nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A little after sunset, I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like someone dragging their fingers along the side of the cabin. It was faint at first, almost like it was part of the wind. But then it got louder. Closer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't dare move. I just sat there, gripping the lantern, listening. The scraping stopped for a moment, and then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time. I stood up, trying to keep as quiet as possible, and made my way to the window. I peeked out, hoping to see what was out there, but there was nothing. Just darkness and trees. But the footsteps continued. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about going outside, maybe trying to confront whoever was out there, but something told me that was a bad idea. I didn't know what they wanted or how many of them there were. I heard the footsteps stop near the back of the cabin, right where the door was. I held my breath, listening for any movement, but the silence stretched on. I couldn't hear anything. Then, suddenly, there was a knock. 3 slow, heavy knocks on the back door. My stomach dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Whoever it was knew I was inside. They were letting me know they were there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just stood in the middle of the cabin, gripping the lantern so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Let me in." It was a man's voice, deep and calm, like he was asking for something simple. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. "Let me in," he repeated, this time with more insistence. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stood there, praying he would go away. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I couldn't hear any footsteps, couldn't hear anything at all. It was like the whole forest had gone quiet, waiting. For what felt like hours, I stood there, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. The only sound was the wind outside, brushing against the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the darkness outside, listening for any signs of movement. But the man never came back. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother to clean up or check out. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. As I drove away from the cabin, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty, and the woods slowly faded into the distance. I don't know who or what was following me in the woods that day, or who had been inside the cabin. But I do know one thing: I'll never go hiking alone again. I rented a cabin in the mountains for a few days to get away from everything. It was in the middle of nowhere, a little wooden place tucked into the trees, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the branches and birds singing in the distance. I needed the quiet. I needed the space. The drive took me almost 6 hours, and by the time I pulled up, the sun was just starting to set. The cabin was simple: 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area. The bathroom was down a short hallway, and there was a wood-burning stove in the corner. It smelled like the place hadn't been lived in for a while, a bit musty, but nothing too bad. There was a stack of wood by the stove, and everything else seemed fine. A bit dusty, maybe, but it wasn't like I was expecting luxury. After unpacking, I made some dinner, sat by the stove, and read a book. It felt good to not hear anything but the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I turned my phone off for the trip, and there was no Wi-Fi, so it was just me, the book, and the fire. I stayed up a bit late, enjoying the quiet, then headed to bed. I found the journal the next morning. It was tucked under the bed, half hidden under one of the old wooden slats. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't dropped my phone and bent down to grab it. At first, I thought it was just some old book, but when I opened it, I realized it was a journal. The pages were worn, and some of the ink had faded. I could still make out most of the writing. It didn't have a name or anything on the cover, just plain brown leather with a few scuffs. It looked like it had been there for a while, but someone had definitely been using it recently. I don't know why I started reading it. I guess I was curious. The first few entries seemed normal enough. Whoever wrote it was just jotting down notes about their stay. Little things, like what they had for breakfast, how quiet the cabin was, how nice the forest looked in the early morning light. They mentioned going for hikes and seeing deer in the woods. Nothing strange. But after a few pages, the tone started to change. The entries got shorter, more rushed. There were mentions of seeing someone in the woods. Just glimpses, they said, like someone was standing between the trees, watching them. They thought it was a hunter or another hiker at first, but no one ever got close. They just stood there, far enough away to be hard to see, but close enough that the writer could feel their eyes on them. I figured it was some kind of story, or maybe someone trying to mess with the next guest. I wasn't scared, not yet. But I kept reading. The entries started to get more frantic. Whoever was writing it seemed to be getting paranoid. They said they'd seen the figure closer to the cabin, standing just outside the tree line, always in the same spot, never moving. They tried to approach once, but the figure disappeared into the woods before they could get close. That night, they heard noises outside the cabin, footsteps crunching on the leaves, but when they looked out the window, there was no one there. By this point, I was feeling a little uneasy. The journal didn't seem like a joke anymore. The handwriting was getting messier, shakier. It looked like whoever wrote it had been really scared. I wasn't sure what to think. I mean, it could still have been some kind of prank, but it was unsettling. The last few entries were the worst. They talked about waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone walking around outside. The person writing it said they'd seen the figure standing right at the edge of the porch, just staring at the cabin. They couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, but they knew it was the same person from the woods. The journal ended abruptly, with one last entry saying they were leaving the next morning. They didn't feel safe anymore. The date on the last entry was the day before I arrived. I put the journal down, feeling a bit on edge. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, not really, but the fact that it ended so suddenly, the fact that it was dated so close to my stay, it just made my skin crawl a little. I told myself it was just a story, that someone had left it there as a way to freak out the next person. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise from outside made me jump. The wind in the trees, the creak of the cabin settling, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. My mind kept drifting back to the journal, to the figure the writer had mentioned. I kept imagining someone standing just outside, staring at the cabin, watching me. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up in the middle of the night. It was dark, pitch black, except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. The cabin was dead silent. I lay there for a few moments, trying to calm down, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal outside. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the leaves outside. They were close, too close. I held my breath, listening, hoping it was just my imagination. But they kept going, circling the cabin, moving from one side to the other. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped for a moment, right outside the bedroom window. I didn't dare look. I didn't want to see what was out there. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away from the cabin, back into the woods. I waited, not sure if they were really gone. Eventually, the sounds faded into the distance, and I was left alone in the silence again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, listening, waiting for the footsteps to come back. In the morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was leaving, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin, clear, human footprints. They circled the cabin, just like I had heard the night before. I didn't stick around to see where they led. I got in my car and drove away, not looking back. I don't know who was out there, watching the cabin. I don't know if it was the same person from the journal, or if it was just some stranger passing through. But I do know one thing, I'm never going back to that cabin again. I moved into the cabin a few months ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a little place tucked away in the woods, a few miles off the main road. I needed the quiet, the space, after everything that had happened in the city. The cabin wasn't isolated, exactly. There were a few others scattered down the road, but they were far enough away that I felt like I had my own little corner of the world. There was one house about half a mile down the road. It looked old, with chipped paint and a sagging roof, but I never saw anyone there when I first moved in. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were always dark. It didn't bother me. If anything, it made the area feel more private. A few weeks in, though, I started seeing signs that someone was living there. One morning, I noticed a truck in the driveway. It looked old, like it had been sitting for years, but now it was parked neatly, as if someone had moved it recently. A couple of days later, I saw a man outside, cutting the grass with a rusted push mower. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a thick beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I didn't think much of it at first. People move in and out all the time, and maybe they just hadn't been around when I first got there. But then they started coming by. At first, it was just a man. He stopped by one afternoon while I was working on my garden, introduced himself as Carl, and asked if I needed any help. I told him I was fine, that I had everything under control, and he just kind of stood there for a moment, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. He came back the next day, knocking on my door with a basket of vegetables. "Thought you could use these," he said, holding it out with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I thanked him, took the basket, and tried to make some small talk. He didn't really engage, though just kept asking me if I was settled in, if I needed anything, if I was ever lonely out here. It wasn't long before his wife showed up. Her name was Linda, and she was quiet, always standing just behind Carl whenever they came by together. She never really spoke, just nodded along to whatever Carl said. They started showing up more often, with little excuses, thought you might want some eggs or we had some extra firewood. Every time they came by, they stayed a little longer, asking more questions about me, about how long I planned to stay, if I was expecting visitors. It started to get on my nerves. I didn't want to be rude. They were my only neighbors, and I figured they were just trying to be friendly. But there was something off about the way they lingered, the way they watched me, like they were waiting for something. Then one night, things got worse. I was in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, but then it got louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the cabin. My heart started racing. I thought maybe it was an animal, but the footsteps were too steady for that. I sat up, listening, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom window. I didn't dare move. I just stared at the window, the moonlight casting shadows across the floor, waiting for whatever was out there to leave. And then I saw them. Carl and Linda, standing just outside, staring into the window. Their faces were blank, expressionless, their eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the nightstand, but I didn't want to reach for it, didn't want them to see me move. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? That my neighbors were standing outside, staring at me? It sounded crazy. I stayed still for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, listening, waiting for them to come back. The next morning, I considered leaving, packing up and driving back to the city. But I didn't want to run. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of scaring me away. So I stayed. I told myself it was just a weird moment, that maybe they were looking for something outside and didn't realize I could see them. But things didn't get better. They started coming by more often, sometimes twice a day. They'd knock on my door and wait for me to answer, even when I pretended I wasn't home. I'd look out the window and see them standing there, staring at the door, waiting. When I finally opened it, Carl would smile that same smile, ask the same questions, linger in the doorway like he didn't want to leave. I stopped answering the door. I stopped going outside as much. I even put up curtains to block the windows, but I could still feel their presence. I'd hear footsteps on the porch at night, the sound of someone walking around the cabin. Once, I found muddy footprints leading up to my back door, but when I looked outside, no one was there. Then, one night, I woke up to a noise inside the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the sound of something creaking, like the floorboards were shifting under someone's weight. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the room. Nothing. But then I heard it again, coming from the living room. I got out of bed, my hands shaking, and slowly crept down the hallway. The cabin was dark, except for the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. I held my breath, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the house settling. But as I reached the living room, I saw it. The front door was opened, just a crack, and there, standing in the doorway, was Carl. He was just standing there, staring at me, his hand on the doorknob like he was about to walk inside. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice shaking. Carl didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring, his face blank. After a few moments, he slowly closed the door and walked away, disappearing into the night. I locked the door, checked all the windows, and sat on the couch, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police seemed pointless. Carl hadn't done anything illegal, not really, but the way he'd been acting, the way he just stood there in the doorway. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things and called the rental company, telling them I was leaving early. I didn't give them a reason, didn't want to explain what had been happening. I just needed to get out of there. As I was loading my car, I saw Carl and Linda standing in their driveway, watching me. They didn't wave, didn't say anything. They just stood there, staring, until I drove away. I don't know what they wanted, or why they'd been so interested in me. Maybe they were just lonely, maybe they were bored, but something about the way they watched me, The way they showed up at all hours, the way Carl had stood in my doorway in the middle of the night. I've tried to forget about it, tried to move on, but every now and then, I'll catch myself looking out my window, half expecting to see them standing there, watching. I had rented a small cabin in the mountains for a week to get away from everything. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. The cabin was isolated, but not completely removed. There were other cabins scattered around, but none close enough to bother me. I had planned to spend most of my time hiking and enjoying the quiet. The first few days went smoothly. The trails were beautiful, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. I spent hours exploring, taking in the fresh air and the views. It was easy to forget the stress of everyday life. On the fourth day, I decided to take a new trail I had heard about from a local shopkeeper. It was supposed to lead to a great overlook. I packed a small backpack with some water and snacks and set out in the morning. The trail was less traveled than the others, which made it even more appealing. About halfway through the hike, I came across an abandoned backpack lying on the trail. It was old, with frayed edges and dirt taped on the bottom. I stopped and looked around, expecting to see someone coming back to retrieve it, but there was no one in sight. I walked up to it and carefully examined it. It seemed out of place, given the condition of the trail and the fact that it was the only item around. I opened the backpack to see if there was anything useful or identifying inside. There was a flashlight, some granola bars, a couple of water bottles, and a notebook. The notebook was weathered, and the pages were crinkled. I flipped through it but found nothing unusual, just some notes about hiking trails and personal musings. I should have left the backpack where I found it, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured I'd take it back to the cabin, thinking I might find a clue about who it belonged to or if there was a number to call. By the time I made it back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sky was overcast, and the air was beginning to chill. I approached the cabin and noticed something immediately. There was a note taped to the door. The note was written in messy, block letters. It read, "You're next." My heart sank. I stood there, staring at the note, trying to make sense of it. There was no indication that anyone had been around recently. The cabin looked the same as I had left it. I pulled the note off the door, and as I did, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned it over to see if there was anything else written on the back, but it was blank. I quickly went inside and locked the door behind me. I double-checked all the windows and made sure everything was secure. I felt a growing sense of dread, realizing that the note could have been meant for me. The backpack and the note seemed connected, but I couldn't figure out how. I tried to stay calm. I made a few phone calls, but there was no signal out here. The only way to reach anyone would be to drive down the mountain, but it was already getting dark. I wasn't sure what to do, so I decided to stay put and keep an eye out. The night was unsettling. I kept checking the windows, listening for any sounds outside. The wind picked up, making eerie noises as it howled through the trees. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I could barely focus. Around midnight, I heard a loud thump from outside. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been dropped. I froze, straining to hear if there were any more noises. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. There was nothing but darkness and the occasional rustle of leaves. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, jumping at every little noise. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The note kept replaying in my mind, "You're next." What did it mean? Was someone out there? As soon as it was light, I packed a few things and drove down to the nearest town. I went straight to the sheriff's office and showed them the note and the backpack. The sheriff listened to my story, looked at the note, and said they'd look into it. They seemed concerned, but they didn't have any immediate answers. I returned to the cabin that afternoon, more anxious than before. I kept expecting to see someone lurking around or to find more notes. I checked the area around the cabin for any signs of intrusion, but found nothing. The backpack was still in the cabin, and I didn't dare touch it again. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept the lights on and the doors locked, but the unease didn't leave me. The note had made it clear that someone knew I was there, and they had been watching me. I kept wondering if they had followed me back from the trail, if the backpack had been a trap, or if it had been left there deliberately to scare me. The next day, I packed up my things and left the cabin early. I couldn't stay there any longer. I was afraid of what might happen next, of what might be lurking in the shadows. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, hoping I wouldn't have to come back. The sheriff never found any conclusive evidence or leads on who might have left the note or the backpack. They assured me they were keeping an eye on things, but I never went back to that cabin. The experience left me shaken and wary of ever being alone in the mountains again. I rented a cabin for a week up in the mountains, hoping for a peaceful escape. The cabin was nice, surrounded by dense forest, but it was isolated enough that I felt completely cut off from the outside world. The first few days were great, hiking during the day and relaxing at night. One afternoon, I decided to explore a part of the forest I hadn't seen yet. I had been following a well-marked trail when I noticed a narrow path leading off into the trees. It was unmarked and looked almost hidden. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to some interesting spot or overlook. The trail was overgrown and a bit hard to navigate. It moved through thick brush and the trees seemed to close in around me. I kept pushing forward, telling myself it was just an adventure and I'd head back soon if it didn't look promising. After about an hour, the path suddenly opened up into a small clearing. What I saw there made me stop in my tracks. There was a makeshift camp set up in the middle of this clearing, tents, a small fire pit, and various personal belongings scattered around. It looked like someone had been living here for a while. At first, I thought it might be a group of campers who had set up their base here, but something felt off. The area looked too organized, and the tents were a bit too well worn. I could see some clothing drying on the line and a few metal cans and bottles lying around. I stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to figure out if I should just turn back. But before I could make a decision, I heard voices coming from one of the tents. I took a deep breath and started to turn around, but it was too late. A group of people emerged from the tents. They were dressed in ragged clothes, and their faces were dirty. One of them, a man with a scruffy beard and wild eyes, spotted me right away. He shouted something to the others, and soon the entire group was looking at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something menacing about the way they stared at me. I tried to back away slowly, hoping they'd let me leave without trouble. But as soon as I moved, the man with the scruffy beard started walking towards me. The others followed, closing in on me. I realized then that I was in a precarious situation. "Where do you think you're going?" the man asked, his voice harsh. I tried to explain that I had stumbled upon their camp by accident and that I meant no harm. I told them I was just exploring and wanted to go back to my cabin. The man didn't seem to care about my explanations. He told me firmly that I wasn't welcome there and that I needed to stay. The other people in the camp were nodding and murmuring in agreement. They formed a circle around me, blocking any path I could take to escape. My heart was pounding. I was scared and felt trapped. I looked around for any possible way out, but the dense forest surrounded the clearing on all sides. I had no idea how far I had wandered from the cabin, and I had no idea how to get back without finding the trail again. One of the women in the group, who looked slightly more approachable than the others, came up to me. She told me that they had their reasons for staying hidden and that they didn't take kindly to strangers. She said they'd let me leave, but only if I promised not to tell anyone about what I had seen. I agreed, desperate to get out of there. They seemed to be holding to their word, as they allowed me to leave the clearing. The man with the scruffy beard stayed behind, but he kept a close eye on me as I made my way back. I retraced my steps as best as I could, trying to remember the path I had taken. My fear was overwhelming, and I was anxious the entire time. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Eventually, I found my way back to the cabin. I was relieved to see it in the distance. Once I got inside, I locked all the doors and windows and took a deep breath. I was safe for now, but the encounter left me shaken. I never spoke to anyone about the camp or what happened that day. I left the cabin a day early, unable to shake the unease and fear. The group in the clearing had made it clear that they did not want to be discovered, and I had no intention of crossing their path again. To this day, I am still haunted by that experience. The fear of stumbling into something dangerous and the feeling of being watched lingered long after I left those mountains. I made sure to stick to well-traveled trails from then on and always paid close attention to where I was going. The encounter served as a stark reminder that not every adventure is as harmless as it seems. I rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin was cozy and isolated, nestled deep in the forest. I thought it would be a great place to relax and enjoy some solitude. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, read a bit, and went to bed early. The silence of the forest was calming. The only sounds I heard were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I needed. But then, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud knocking at the cabin door. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, trying to make sense of the noise. It was persistent, rhythmic, and loud enough to pierce through the quiet of the night. I felt a surge of anxiety. Who could be knocking on my door at this hour? I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and quietly got out of bed. My mind was racing with possibilities, but I tried to stay calm. I made my way to the door, the knocking growing louder as I approached. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. I opened the door slowly, peering into the darkness. There was no one there. I stepped outside and shone the flashlight around, but the area was empty. The only thing I noticed was a set of fresh, muddy footprints leading away from the cabin and into the woods. The prints were clear and seemed to have been made recently, given the rain earlier that day. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The footprints led directly from my door into the dense forest, which was now shrouded in darkness. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. The silence of the forest felt different now, thicker, more oppressive. I considered calling the police, but the nearest town was miles away and I had no cell service. I stood outside for a few more minutes, trying to decide what to do. The knocking had stopped, and the only sound was the occasional crackle of leaves underfoot. I knew I had to go back inside. I didn't want to be outside alone in the dark any longer than necessary. As I closed the door, I made sure to lock it securely. I checked all the windows and doors, ensuring everything was fastened tightly. The cabin had an old lock on the front door that I was sure was sturdy, but after what had happened, I wasn't taking any chances. I tried to settle back into bed, but sleep was elusive. Every little sound seemed amplified, and I kept hearing creaks and groans from the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. Why had someone come to the door? Who was it, and what did they want? Hours passed, and the fear slowly faded into exhaustion. I finally managed to fall asleep, but it was fitful and restless. I dreamed of shadowy figures and ominous forests. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining and the forest looked much less menacing in the daylight. I decided to investigate the footprints. I followed them into the woods, hoping to find some clue about who had been there and why. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding through trees and underbrush. The tracks were clear, but they eventually led to a point where they simply stopped. There were no signs of anyone or anything beyond that point. I spent a few hours searching the area but found nothing else. It was as if the person who had made the tracks had vanished into thin air. The forest was still and quiet, with only the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. I returned to the cabin and decided to pack up early. I wasn't comfortable staying another night, and the unsettling feeling had taken away any desire I had to relax. I made sure to check every corner at the cabin and double-check that everything was in order before I left. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced back at the forest one last time. The tranquil scene was a stark contrast to the terror I had felt the night before. I drove home with a sense of relief, grateful to be back in a place where I felt safe. I never found out who or what had come to my cabin that night. The muddy footprints remained a mystery, and the incident left me shaken. I had always wanted a break from the constant noise of the city, so I rented a small, remote cabin by an old quarry for a week. The place was isolated, with no neighbors around for miles. It seemed perfect for a quiet retreat. I arrived on a sunny afternoon, unpacked my things, and spent the day settling in. The cabin was quaint, with old wooden floors and a big stone fireplace that seemed perfect for cozy nights. The first few nights were peaceful. I spent my evenings reading by the fire and sleeping deeply, lulled by the silence of the surrounding forest. It was everything I had hoped for. However, things started to change on the fourth night. Around midnight, I was woken by a strange sound. It was a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to be coming from outside. I listened carefully and realized it sounded like machinery. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps some distant construction, but it felt too close to be that far away. I got up and checked all the windows, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I decided to go back to bed, though the noise kept me awake for the rest of the night. The next night, the noise was back, louder this time. I could hear voices as well, muffled but unmistakable. I felt a growing unease. The cabin was supposed to be far from any kind of community, so where was this sound coming from? I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just some machinery from an old factory or something that I hadn't noticed before. But the voices were unsettling. They had an angry, urgent tone. By the third night of hearing these noises, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, a knife for protection, and headed out into the darkness. The noises seemed to come from the direction of the quarry, so I made my way cautiously through the dense woods, following the sound. The forest was thick and tangled, and I had to push through branches and brambles. As I got closer, the noise grew louder. The machinery sound was unmistakable now, and I could hear voices more clearly. They were shouting, though I couldn't make out the words. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the edge of the quarry. The moonlight illuminated the old quarry pit, revealing a large, abandoned area that seemed to have been repurposed. What I saw next made my blood run cold. There were lights set up around the quarry, and several trucks were parked there. I could see figures moving about. They were working with large pieces of machinery and seemed to be loading something into the trucks. I couldn't see the details from where I was, but it looked like they were doing something illegal. It wasn't just the machinery and trucks, the whole scene felt off. I turned to leave, but just as I was about to head back, I heard a twig snap behind me. I froze. I slowly turned around, and there, standing a few feet away, were two men. They looked at me with cold, hard expressions. One of them stepped forward and said, "You shouldn't be here." I tried to stay calm, but my mind raced. I turned and started walking back toward the cabin, my heart racing. I could hear the men following me, though they kept their distance. When I reached the cabin, I bolted the door and locked all the windows. I knew I had to get out of there as soon as possible. I called the local police from my cell phone, but of course, there was no signal. I felt trapped. I decided to wait until morning. I spent the night with a knife in my hand, listening to every sound outside. I could still hear occasional noises, but they were fainter. I spent the whole night trying to stay alert and safe. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed my things quickly and prepared to leave. I was terrified and wanted nothing more than to get away from that place. I didn't dare go back to the quarry to see if they were still there. I just drove as fast as I could, my nerves on edge the whole way. When I reached the nearest town, I contacted the police and reported what I had seen. They promised to look into it, but I never followed up to see what they found. I never returned to that cabin or any place similar. The experience left me shaken and wary of isolated places. The fear of what could have happened at night stayed with me long after I had left. I had rented a cabin by a small lake for a week to enjoy some peaceful fishing. The cabin was remote, tucked away in the woods, with no neighbors in sight. It was perfect for getting away from everything. The first few days were exactly what I hoped for. I fished during the day, read books, and relaxed by the fire at night. One afternoon, while I was fishing from the bank, two men approached. They were in their late 30s or early 40s, wearing old fishing vests and hats. They were friendly enough at first. They asked about my setup and seemed genuinely interested in the type of bait I was using in the rod I had. I showed them my gear and answered their questions, though I found their curiosity a bit unusual. They told me they had been fishing further down the lake but decided to come over to see how I was doing. They were polite but overly interested in the specifics of my fishing gear and how I had set up my campsite. After chatting for a while, they left, saying they would see me around. I thought nothing of it and continued fishing, though I felt a little unsettled by their interest. That night, as I was finishing dinner and preparing to head inside, I noticed headlights approaching from the direction of the lake. I went to the window and saw the two men's truck pulling up. I felt a knot in my stomach. It was dark by then, and I wasn't expecting anyone else around. They got out of their truck and started walking towards my cabin. I decided to go outside to see what they wanted. As I stepped out, they greeted me with forced smiles. They said they had come to check out the cabin because they were thinking of renting it in the future. They asked if they could look around, but their manner was different from earlier. It felt off, like they had some other agenda. I was worried but didn't want to be rude. I showed them the cabin's exterior and the area around it, though I kept my distance. They kept making small talk, asking questions about the lake and the surrounding area, but they seemed less interested in the fishing and more interested in the layout of the cabin and the placement of things around the campsite. When they finally left, I made sure to lock up everything and secure the cabin as best as I could. I had a feeling that something wasn't right, but I tried to push it out of my mind. I went to bed, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. In the middle of the night, I was woken by a noise outside. It sounded like someone moving around near my fishing gear. I turned on the light and peered out the window but saw nothing. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went outside to check. The night was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake's water. My fishing equipment and camping gear were exactly as I had left them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been around. I went back inside and double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, though I had already made sure they were secure. The next morning, I noticed that some of my gear had been moved. The tackle box was in a different spot, and a few items that had been neatly packed were now scattered around. It was clear someone had been in my campsite. I felt a surge of panic. I checked to make sure nothing was missing and found everything accounted for, but the feeling of unease lingered. I packed up my things and decided to leave the cabin a day early. I didn't want to stick around and find out what the men might have been up to. As I was loading my car, I saw their truck parked a little further down the road. I had the unsettling feeling they were watching me from a distance. I made it back home without further incident, but the whole experience left me shaken. I've since avoided renting isolated cabins and always take extra precautions when I'm alone in unfamiliar places.